They were there to observe me. I'll never forget the day 2 grown women were introduced to our second grade class as observers. It all sounded so innocuous at first. They'd watch our teacher do her thing, maybe take notes for some academic research, and then vanish as quietly as they'd arrived. That's what our teacher told us anyway. She brought them to the front of the classroom, said something along the lines of, "Boys and girls, these ladies will be joining us for a few days. They're going to watch me teach. Please ignore them and act like they're not here." With that, each took a seat at one of the tiny desks in the back row, legs awkwardly folded because those desks were meant for 8-year-olds, not grown adults. A pair of clipboards appeared, and they started writing away, glancing at the front of the class, scanning their eyes across the rows, but focusing especially on me, or so it felt. I had no idea what was in store. For several days they shadowed us. Sometimes they'd stay for just an hour, sometimes they'd linger through an entire lesson. Each time they wrote furiously on their clipboards, occasionally whispering to each other, but never speaking aloud to the class. I remember thinking, are they real teachers? Researchers? Why did they need to take notes on something as ordinary as a second grade lesson? On long vowels, or basic subtraction? The entire situation was peculiar enough that it quickly became the talk among my classmates. Whenever the women stepped out of the room, the moment the observers were gone, the chatter rose. What do you think they're writing about? They're probably from the government. Maybe they're like secret scientists? In a second grade mind, there was no limit to how extravagant or mysterious these women might be. Meanwhile, my teacher told us repeatedly, just act natural, continue a normal routine. So we did. Although you can't truly be normal when there are strangers scribbling away in the back, right? The presence of these women made me self-conscious, especially because I suspected they might be there for a reason beyond just observing the teacher. It's hard to explain why I felt singled out, but I often caught them glancing directly at me in a way that gave me a strange, stomach-knotting sensation. Their eyes would linger if I raised my hand to answer a question, or if I stood up to get a tissue. In a corner of my mind, a little voice said, "Something's off," but I shrugged it off because, at 8 years old, you don't exactly jump to complicated conclusions. The real shock came on Friday. Our teacher announced that for recess, everyone could line up and head outside, but then she singled me out, saying I had to stay behind for a little bit. Instantly, my heart jumped into my throat. Had I done something wrong? I glanced at my classmates, filing out with excited chatter. The weather was decent, and they were all eager to run around, maybe toss a ball or play tag. Meanwhile, I was being forced to stay in the classroom with the teacher, her aide, and these 2 mysterious women. My anxiety spiked. You know that hot flush that creeps up when you realize you might be in serious trouble. That's exactly how I felt. As soon as the class disappeared, the women repositioned themselves. They placed 2 chairs in the center of the room, facing each other, and pointed for me to take a seat in one of them. My teacher and her aide stood a few steps behind the women, arms crossed, eyes on me. I remember my teacher wearing a concerned but not exactly angry expression. Her aide was more neutral, like this was protocol, but the 2 strangers seemed extremely serious, far more intense than anyone I'd encountered in that setting. They weren't yelling, but their seriousness was palpable, and for an 8-year-old, that can be terrifying. They introduced themselves, though I don't recall their names at all, and explained that they were there to observe my recent test performance. Apparently, my teacher had noticed a drastic drop in my grades. They told me, politely but firmly, that they saw I'd been nailing my spelling and math tests earlier in the year, perfect or near perfect scores. But in the last couple weeks, I'd suddenly bombed a series of quizzes and exams in those exact subjects. My teacher was confused because I was usually enthusiastic, volunteering answers during class, reading ahead in the textbook, and generally performing well. So she couldn't figure out why, out of nowhere, my papers were riddled with bizarre mistakes, like spelling cat as cat, or misreading simple math problems I'd mastered a month earlier. I remember them pulling out sheets of paper, my own tests, and comparing them side by side. One was from a month prior, where I had near-perfect spelling on a list of maybe 20 words. Then a recent test showed me failing spectacularly, messing up words like they Or what? That I'd spelled correctly before. It was the same story with math problems. Previously, I'd done double-digit addition with no issue. But then I was suddenly flubbing single-digit subtraction. They asked, "Does this make sense to you?" Of course I couldn't meet their eyes for more than a second at a time. I just fidgeted in my seat. Then came the question, "Have you been failing these tests on purpose?" That's when everything turned upside down in my mind. I felt my entire body go hot. My heart slammed against my ribs. I had never been confronted by authority figures in such a direct way, especially not for something like intentionally failing. The whole moment felt like a slow-motion scene in a movie. They were leaning in, their pens poised on their clipboards, waiting for me to respond. Here's the thing. They were right. It was all a ruse. I had been deliberately failing. But up until then, my teacher or anyone else hadn't suspected it. At least not enough to outright ask me. I mean, what 8-year-old intentionally bombs tests? The idea must have seemed so outlandish that my teacher had to bring in these educational specialists, or whatever they were, to figure out what was happening. So I stared down at my hands, my little feet dangling from the chair, and I had no choice but to come clean. I remember mumbling a soft yes, admitting I'd been faking. The moment I said it, I could sense the teacher and her aide shifting their stance behind the women. They probably felt both relieved and incredulous. The women, on the other hand, didn't immediately react. One just said, "Okay," in a calm tone. But the calmness felt scarier than someone shouting. They had the presence of people who were used to dealing with kids, but also used to nailing down the truth. When they asked me why, I hesitated. Telling them the real reason seemed embarrassing at the time. I just recalled how a couple weeks earlier, I'd noticed a group of kids playing outside the classroom window. They were throwing a ball around, giggling, having what looked like a second recess. Our normal recess was around mid-morning, or just after lunch. This was definitely not that time. So I'd asked around, "Who are they? And why do they get to go outside again?" One of my classmates told me that the group was for kids who struggled with certain subjects, like math, or reading, or spelling. A teacher would come in, grab them in the middle of the day, and they'd have an alternate learning session outside, which sometimes included movement-based or game-like activities to reinforce skills. From my vantage point, it looked like a bonus recess. In truth, it was probably some specialized program designed to help them catch up, maybe with one-on-one support or kinesthetic learning. That little second grade me saw something that looked fun. A group of kids sunshine laughing, and felt immediate jealousy. I craved that break in the day. Why were they allowed to do such a cool thing while I was stuck in class doing normal assignments? So I made the logical leap, at least in my 8-year-old brain. If those kids got to go because they were bad at math and spelling, I'd have to be bad at math and spelling too. How to do that? Fail tests. But how to fail just enough so they'd notice and think I needed this special group? Answer: everything incorrectly, consistently. I have this vivid memory of me taking my next spelling test and intentionally messing up. I'd sometimes write a letter incorrectly but then correct it and cross it out, leaving the paper a jumbled mess. The teacher would wander up and down the rows, occasionally glancing at our papers. My heart would pound every time she passed me, worried she might see me obviously flubbing an easy word like "Mom," but she never said anything in the moment. When I got my test back and saw the big fat F at the top, I suppressed a twisted sense of pride. Like, yes, I messed it up effectively enough that it looked legit. Then I waited, expecting to be invited to that magical group. But guess what? I wasn't. Instead, the teacher must have started noticing a pattern, especially since I was still doing fine on homework or random classwork. Perhaps I let my guard down if we did an in-class assignment that wasn't graded. Or maybe I gave a correct answer aloud once or twice. Something must have tipped her off that I wasn't actually struggling. So, instead of giving me a gold ticket to that second recess, I got a visit from these serious-looking women with clipboards. When I finally confessed that I'd done it all to get into the group that, from my perspective, was having a half-day of fun instead of normal schoolwork, the women's faces shifted, like they were holding back some combination of confusion and disappointment. One asked, Do you realize that those kids are out there because they need extra help? It's not a game or a second recess. It's a special program to make sure they catch up on the basics. It's not just for fun. My 8-year-old logic had collapsed under the weight of adult reasoning, and embarrassment crept in me. I looked down, fully aware that my plan was silly from their standpoint, but in my mind, it was total logic. See fun, want fun, do whatever it takes to get that fun. So I told them I was sorry, that I wouldn't do it again, that I understood now. I remember them giving me a gentle lecture about the importance of honesty, about how certain kids really need that extra help, and how faking difficulties could take away resources from those who genuinely need it. They also explained that my teacher was worried because she thought something might be wrong at home. Maybe I was depressed. Maybe there were issues that caused my sudden drop in performance, so that's why they'd been sent to observe me. This moment was my first glimpse into just how seriously a school can take a big shift in a kid's grades. It was also the first time I got scolded by an authority figure who wasn't a parent. One of the women spoke in a very measured tone, calm but firm, telling me that dishonesty about my own academic capabilities wasn't just a harmless trick. It could mislead teachers, lead them to place me in a program I didn't need, and skew resources away from kids who genuinely did. At 8 years old, I couldn't fully grasp the bigger picture, but I got enough of it to feel ashamed. I remember my cheeks burning, my hands trembling a little. I wanted to cry, but I also felt too scared to show that vulnerability. Eventually they dismissed me, saying that recess was almost over, and I could head out if I wanted. When I walked outside, I could barely look my classmates in the eye. Of course they had no clue what happened, but in my head it felt like everyone knew. I tried to focus on the typical recess stuff. Kickball, jump rope, silly schoolyard gossip. But the entire time, I felt like my teacher's gaze was on me, even if she was nowhere near. After that, it just vanished from conversation. Neither my teacher nor those women brought it up again. They gave me space, and I never heard anything from my parents about it either. No lecture or punishment at home. To this day, I have no idea if the school informed them or decided to keep it in-house. Part of me wonders if the teacher might have thought it was a misguided but relatively harmless attempt at gaming the system. No harm done, except for maybe some wasted test papers and the confusion it caused. In the following weeks, my grades returned to normal because I stopped faking. I remember being a lot less carefree, though. I was paranoid that people were watching me more closely. Every time I took a test, I'd think, are they going to suspect me again? Are they going to send more observers if I slip up? Ultimately, nothing like that happened. Life in second grade resumed its typical pattern, yet the event stuck with me. That weird mixture of guilt, embarrassment, and relief at being found out has lingered in my memory. It became this anchor point, my first big realization that grown-ups are paying attention, that the things I do in school have consequences beyond a letter grade. It also taught me something about envy and perspective. I'd seen kids playing outside when in reality, they were in a remedial program to help them with subjects they genuinely struggled anyway. They weren't just out there for fun. They were out there to learn in a different way. My naive 8-year-old viewpoint had twisted the scenario into something else entirely. I look back on that moment and wonder how exactly the teacher decided to bring in those observers. Did she consult the school counselor? Did she mention that she had a bright student suddenly flunking everything in math and spelling? Maybe the administration suspected that I was dealing with a learning disability or some emotional turmoil at home, but once they observed me for a few days, they saw that my in-class behavior and participation contradicted my failing grades, so they confronted me. That in itself is fascinating to me now. How educational specialists or psychologists might come in to watch a child. At the time, I'd never heard of such a thing. I just thought teachers taught, kids learned, the principal handled major trouble. And that was that. I didn't realize how many layers existed behind the scenes. It's also interesting how a child's worldview can lead to such big decisions. At that age, I lacked the nuance to consider that maybe these kids were outside because they needed help. My logic was, they're outside, they're laughing, so they must be having fun. I'm stuck inside, so that's unfair. Then, because I was good at spelling and math, my two best subjects, ironically, I had to sabotage my own performance to qualify. It's almost comedic in hindsight, but at the time, it felt dead serious. In some ways, it was my first attempt at manipulation. I manipulated my teacher's perception of my abilities, thinking I could cheat my way into what I saw as extra recess. That's not something an adult taught me to do. It was just my own little brainstorm. It's strange to think how kids often come up with cunning plans that seem logical in their heads, but fall apart under any real scrutiny. I wonder if other kids in my class tried anything similar, or if I was alone in that kind of imaginative sabotage. I also reflect on how this might have turned out differently if, say, the teacher had just placed me in that group without investigating. Then I might have found myself in remedial lessons, bored and confused, because I didn't actually need help. Maybe I would have been discovered eventually anyway. Or maybe it would have been a giant waste of school resources. The fact that the teacher took it seriously enough to bring in observers actually saved me from getting stuck in a place I didn't belong. Another question that comes to mind is whether my parents were informed. Typically, if a kid in elementary school is suspected of having a learning disability, or if there's a big change in academic performance, parents get a call. But mine never said a word. Maybe the teacher decided to handle it quietly. Maybe the observer ladies concluded that no real discipline was needed beyond that stern talk. After all, I was 8. I was the kind of kid who colored inside the lines, politely waited my turn, and generally did well in class. This was out of character, so perhaps they were lenient, chalking it up to a childish scheme for attention or fun. Either way, from that day forward, I was on my best behavior, academically. I didn't want another run-in with those clipboards and those serious expressions. It was the first time in my life I experienced the kind of heart-thudding, throat-clenching fear that comes from being cornered about something you know you did wrong. I vividly recall the dryness in my mouth, how I had to swallow hard before speaking. That's a sensation that's become all too familiar in adulthood, like during a tough job interview or a reprimand from a boss. But as a second grader, it was brand new. It's fascinating to me, now that I'm 32, how clearly I can still see the scene. The women's matching business casual outfits, the mechanical pencils clipped to their clipboards, the overhead fluorescent lighting that seemed extra bright that Friday, and the hushed tension in the classroom once everyone else went to recess. I can even picture the scuffed tile floor, and how my feet couldn't quite reach it when I sat in that chair, making me feel even smaller. And it's odd that this memory stayed hidden for so long, never discussed with family or friends. It wasn't exactly a traumatic event in the grand scheme of things, but it certainly taught me an early lesson about consequences. Maybe the reason I never told anyone is because part of me felt ashamed. I'd done something deceptive and got caught. Another part of me just moved on. After all, life at 8 moves pretty fast. There are new things to worry about every day. Playdates, school projects, random kid drama. I sometimes think about how different aspects of childhood can push us to do strange things. I wasn't acting out of malicious intent. I just wanted more fun in my school day. Looking back, it's almost sweet that I believed I could outsmart the entire system, that I could fake being bad at what I was best at, just to gain an extra break. Children are simpler, but also more creative in how they approach problems. My solution was straightforward. If I want to be included, I must pretend I'm struggling, because that's the only ticket in. Never once did I consider just asking the teacher, could I have an extra break, or telling my parents, I see kids playing outside, can I join them? That's the difference in a kid's mindset. We often jump to extremes. As for the scolding, I remember one of the women leaning forward, her voice low and calm, saying something like, your teacher has been worried about you. She cares about you a lot. And when she sees you doing well 1 minute, and failing the next, it raises alarm. We wanted to make sure nothing was wrong. Do you understand how serious this could be if you kept pretending to fail? My 8-year-old self could barely whisper a response. It felt like I'd disappointed them on a fundamental level, even though it was a mild event compared to real discipline. The weight of their disappointment was massive for a child. I think that's part of why it jolted me so deeply. I was a people pleaser by nature, always wanting my teachers to like me. So, to find out that they had to bring in outsiders to investigate my bizarre drop in grades, well, that was a huge blow to my sense of being the good kid. I don't recall the exact phrases they used, but I do remember feeling I'd let down my teacher. She was a kind person, Generally, the thought that I'd caused her concern or confusion lingered with me. From that point on, I became more conscious of how my actions in school might affect others. If I acted out or did something sneaky, it wasn't just me facing the consequences. Teachers, counselors, administrators might get involved, worried that something deeper was wrong. For the rest of the school year, my teacher didn't treat me any differently. At least not in a way I could detect. She was still supportive, still gave me gold stars on my spelling tests when I got them all correct. I guess she understood that I was just being a kid, maybe testing boundaries. Occasionally, if I was finishing an assignment early, she'd let me help another student. I don't know if that was a direct response to the incident, like an attempt to show me that helping someone is more rewarding than pretending to be struggling. But I definitely interpreted it that way. It felt good to be useful in a genuine sense, not by faking difficulty, but by lending someone else the strengths I actually had. Looking back, I also realize how I misread what I saw outside that classroom window. Maybe those kids appeared to be having fun, but perhaps they were just as self-conscious about being pulled out of class for extra help. They might have felt singled out, or embarrassed about needing remedial lessons. That's an angle my 8-year-old self never considered. From my vantage point, it was simply, they're outside, I'm inside, I'm missing out. But that's the beauty of maturity, seeing that experiences vary from person to person, and not everything is as it seems at first glance. In my adult life, the memory of those two women with clipboards occasionally resurfaces when I see stories about kids trying to game the school system in small ways, pretending to be sick to skip class, forging notes, or feigning ignorance to fit in. Our childhood is rife with these little manipulations. Maybe it's part of developing social and problem-solving skills, albeit in misguided ways. You test the waters, see if you can trick the adults. Usually you get caught, but that's how you learn boundaries. Interestingly, I never learned exactly what their official roles were. Were they psychologists, academic performance evaluators, special education assessors? They obviously had the authority to observe and question me privately. The way they handled me, firm but not cruel, suggests they'd done this type of thing before. They expertly probed my motivations and got me to confess without me feeling coerced. As scary as it felt at the time, now I see it as a pretty skillful approach. They diffused a potential misunderstanding by going straight to the source. My teacher's aide was also there, standing off to the side like a silent guardian. I don't recall her ever speaking up. She was just there in case things got intense, I guess. Her presence added to the tension, because she'd always been the gentle sidekick who helped pass out worksheets, or guided us to the bathroom in a neat line. Seeing her watch me with a serious expression felt alien. It underscored the gravity of the situation. After recess that day, I came back inside feeling a tiny bit lighter, mostly because I knew I'd come clean, and they weren't going to keep pressing. No one gave me dirty looks or whispered behind my back. It was like the entire ordeal existed in a bubble. Just me, those women, my teacher, and her aide. When my classmates returned, they were oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded. They asked if I had a stomachache, or if I got in trouble, and I brushed it off with, "Nah, it was nothing, Kim." The idea that my parents might not know still perplexes me. Usually schools communicate with home about such matters, but I guess it's possible they decided it was a minor enough infraction to handle internally. Or maybe they did tell my parents, and my parents chose not to confront me, thinking I'd already learned my lesson. My parents were typically hands-on, but it wasn't unusual for them to trust the school to handle small issues. If they were informed that I had tried to fail on purpose, just to join the remedial group, maybe they didn't see the need to pile on further punishment. In any case, the moment passed without much fanfare, but it left an indelible mark on me. Over the years, whenever I've come across a situation where someone is faking incompetence to get out of responsibilities or chase some perceived advantage, I think I sort of did that in second grade. Even if the stakes were tiny, I learned that faking weakness or ignorance can backfire, and it often comes with unexpected consequences, like two note-taking adults grilling you at the end of the week. As a 32-year-old reflecting on that memory, I see the humor in it. The logic was so purely childlike. I'm good at math and spelling, but if I get bad enough at them, I'll get a second recess. I can laugh at how simplistic that plan was, but I also see the earnestness in my younger self. I was just a kid who wanted a bit more fun in the day. School can be rigid sometimes, especially if you're a kid who quickly finishes the assigned work and has to sit quietly while others catch up. Maybe I longed for that sense of freedom I saw outside. The whole experience also says something about how schools try to address drastic changes in student performance. It's good that they noticed. Some kids might experience real crises, family troubles, health issues, or other stressors, and the first red flag is a sudden drop in grades. The fact that they acted so quickly in my case means they were paying attention, which I appreciate in retrospect. If I had been struggling for real, it would have been important to get help. It just so happened that my struggle was an act. When I think back to that conference in the classroom, I picture the fluorescent lights humming, the clock ticking, the hum of distant recess noise through the walls. I can still feel the intensity of the women's gazes. That's a testament to how vivid those moments were. It was my first real confrontation with adult-level seriousness, a scenario where I couldn't wriggle out with a quick apology or a cute smile. I had to own up to my plan and face their disapproval. That moment, though scary, was a stepping stone in learning accountability. It's funny how life can hinge on these small events. Plenty of other things happened to me in second grade. Holidays, field trips, birthday parties. But this stands out as a singular milestone in my personal development. Maybe it's because it was the first time I recognized how powerful and simultaneously risky it can be to bend the truth. Or maybe it's because it was a moment when adults treated me like I was capable of orchestrating a deception, which made me see myself in a new light. After second grade, I never attempted a scheme like that again. I continued to do well academically throughout elementary school, occasionally wondering if my teacher shared the story with colleagues. Did she mention me in the break room like, "You'll never believe what this little girl tried to do. She deliberately failed to get into the remedial group"? Who knows? But I'm glad I learned that lesson early, in a relatively controlled environment, rather than trying something similar in high school or beyond, where the consequences might have been much harsher. As for those kids who were out there getting extra help, I sometimes wonder if any of them remember that time. Maybe to them, it wasn't a big deal. They might have recognized it as tutoring, rather than a second recess. But to me, it looked like the promised land. I guess it underscores how kids can misconstrue a situation just by observing it at a distance. That's why communication is crucial. If I'd asked a teacher or parent, "What's happening outside? Can I join? And under what conditions?" I'd have saved myself a lot of trouble. In a way, this memory is a sweetly naive snapshot of childhood. Longing for more play, hatching a half-baked plan, getting called out by the grown-ups, and then never speaking of it again. There was no big punishment, no permanent record, no letter home that said, "Your child is a manipulative mastermind." Just a quiet, pointed intervention, and it worked. I went back to performing at my real level. The remedial group kept doing what they did, and the women with clipboards presumably packed up their notes and moved on to the next school, or the next kid who needed assessment. Decades later, the event is both funny and thought-provoking. It's a reminder that every child is dealing with an internal logic that might make total sense to them, yet it appears utterly baffling to the adults in their life. It also emphasizes the importance of paying attention to sudden changes in a student's academic performance. Sometimes there's a deeper reason, a personal crisis or learning issue, and sometimes it's just a kid who wants an extra recess. Either way, the approach the school took, calm observation followed by direct inquiry, was effective. So that's the story of my secret attempt to dumb myself down in second grade. It never grew into a massive scandal or a repeated pattern, but it remains etched into my memory as a formative little drama. Those two women, armed with clipboards, hushed voices, and serious eyes, gave me my first taste of how it feels to be genuinely, undeniably, found out. My teacher's watchful eye, and her subsequent response showed me that grown-ups see more than we realize, and my own guilt taught me that lying about your capabilities doesn't just cheat the system, it can cheat you out of the chance to appreciate where your true talents lie. I can still picture the exact layout of that classroom. The tables arranged in clusters of 4, the chalkboard up front, the ABS strung across the top of the wall, and a big American flag on a short wooden stand. Those details come flooding back whenever I recall that Friday afternoon. It's funny how a moment of intense emotion engraves every sensory detail into your mind. Even now, I can imagine the rustle of paper, the scratch of pencils, and the murmur of the teacher's aide when she said, "It's okay, you can go to recess now," at the end of that conversation. In the grand timeline of my life, this was just a brief flash. A single conversation in a flurry of many during my elementary years. Yet it resonates as the first time I truly grasped that grown-ups have resources and methods for uncovering the truth, and that I couldn't simply coast by on an obviously suspicious plan without facing questions. It also hammered home the idea that good intentions can't cloak everything. Yes, I just wanted more fun, but the means I chose were misleading and unfair. Even at 8, I learned there's a difference between wanting something harmless, like an extra break, and deceiving teachers to get it. That's why, to this day, I sometimes think back to that memory whenever I see a kid who's doing something that doesn't match their usual pattern. Instead of jumping to conclusions about bad behavior, I think, maybe they're trying to get something they see in a misunderstood way. Kids can have layered motivations, even if they can't articulate them fully. In my case, my teacher and those women solved the puzzle by calmly and directly confronting me. It was terrifying, but it was also the right approach, because it left no lasting negative repercussions, just a lesson. It stands out as a prime example of gentle but firm educational intervention. Nobody screamed. Nobody made me feel like a criminal. They simply laid out the evidence, asked me if I was doing it on purpose, and then pressed me to explain why. Once I told them, they corrected my misconception and gave me a mild scolding, enough to ensure I wouldn't repeat the behavior. Then they let me go back to being an 8-year-old kid. Years later, I'd sometimes recall that day whenever we were asked to write about a formative childhood experience. I never actually wrote the story in detail, probably due to embarrassment, or just because I wasn't sure how to frame it. But now that I'm older, I can see it was a valuable moment of childhood growth. A mini parable of envy, misunderstanding, and consequences. It's a reminder of how big the world can feel when you're small, and how the grown-ups have systems in place that are invisible until you accidentally run afoul of them. I still wonder what might have happened if I'd kept failing longer. Would the teacher eventually place me in that remedial group? Or would she dig deeper, bring in more staff to observe me, maybe even test me for a disability? Maybe they'd interview my parents, do home visits, or who knows what else. Luckily, it never went that far. My fiasco only lasted a couple of weeks before they swooped in to address it. Another lingering question is what those two women wrote on their clipboards. Did they label me as Kid 7? Engages in purposeful failing to join special group. Possible envy issue. Did they fill out forms stating I was academically gifted, but socially misinformed? I'll never know, but it's fascinating to think that my name might have been in some official report somewhere, describing how a second grader tried to flunk her way into an extra break. In the big scheme of things, it's probably just a footnote in a school's file that's long since been archived or destroyed. Whatever happened to them, I hope they continue to work with kids in a way that blended compassion with discernment, because that's what they displayed to me. They weren't cruel, but they were unwavering in their quest to figure out what was going on. At 8, that felt terrifying. But now, I recognize it as professionalism. Ultimately, this memory taught me that what looks like recess from a distance could be something else entirely. It taught me that faking weakness or failure is never a reliable shortcut to something you think you want, because more often than not, the truth surfaces. And it taught me that grown-ups might be more aware than we give them credit for, and they can tap resources outside the classroom if they suspect a kid is struggling, or in my case, scheming. I guess if I could talk to my 8-year-old self, I'd say, your strengths are something to be proud of, not to hide. If you want to break, or if you're curious about that group outside, just ask someone what it's really about. You might realize it's not what you think, but that's the nature of childhood. We learn by doing, even if it means messing up. If we're lucky, we get corrected gently, the way I did, and carry that lesson forward. To this day, none of my relatives or close friends have heard the story. Until now, I suppose. It was something I assumed nobody would understand, or find relevant. But looking back, it's a small but significant snippet of how children's minds work, and how schools deal with sudden academic anomalies. For me, It's become an amusing anecdote that underscores a deeper truth. Sometimes the best lessons we learn are the ones we stumbled into by accident, driven by a childish misconception, and then got set straight by concerned, if somewhat intimidating, adults with clipboards.